In the depths of ancient Buddhist traditions, there lies a truth that transcends time. The human mind is like a vast ocean, where every wave represents a thought, every current an emotion, and every drop a fragment of the universal consciousness that binds us all. This is a story passed down from master to disciple through the centuries, whispered in the halls of monasteries, and preserved not in scrolls, but in the hearts of those who truly seek to understand the nature of the human mind. In an ancient monastery, hidden amidst the mists of the highest Tibetan mountains, there lived an old monk whose eyes held the depth of 1,000 crystalline lakes. His silent footsteps carried wisdom through the stone corridors, and his presence had the power to soothe even the most restless hearts. The other monks said he could read people's minds, but the truth was far deeper than any supernatural gift. One autumn morning, as golden leaves danced in the air like scattered thoughts, a young man arrived at the monastery. His eyes carried the weight of 1,000 unasked questions, and his shoulders were bent under the burden of expectations imposed not by others, but by himself. The old monk, seated on his veranda of ancient wood, watched the young man's every movement as though reading a sacred book. He noticed how the young man paused every 3 steps to adjust his already immaculate robes, a reflection of his constant need for control and perfection. He saw how the man's restless eyes sought approval in every face he encountered, revealing a heart hungry for acceptance. He observed how he clutched his small travel bag to his chest, as though it contained not just his few belongings, but all his memories and fears. The old monk closed his eyes for a moment, and in his mind appeared the image of a humble house on the plains, where a loving mother brewed jasmine tea every afternoon to calm her anxious son. Without hesitation, the monk rose silently and made his way to the monastery's kitchen. When the young man finally reached the main entrance, trembling and exhausted, not just from the physical journey, but from the inner battle he was fighting, he found the old monk waiting for him with a steaming cup of jasmine tea. The familiar aroma brought tears to his eyes, and for the first time since his journey began, his shoulders relaxed. "How did you know?" the young man asked, his voice barely containing his surprise. The old monk smiled gently and replied, "When the waters of a lake are disturbed, they reflect 1,000 fragmented suns. But when they are still, they perfectly reflect the entire moon. Our mind is like that water. When we learn to calm it, we begin to see not only our own reflection clearly, but also the reflection of all beings around us." The young man held the cup with both hands, feeling its warmth spread through his fingers. In that moment, he began to understand that true mind reading was not a mystical power, but a profound ability to observe, born from inner stillness. The old monk had not read his mind. He had read his story through his gestures, his gaze, his posture. Every small movement was a word in an open book, every expression a complete sentence in the narrative of his life. "Every person we meet," the old monk continued, "carries an entire universe of stories, fears, dreams, and hopes. These universes manifest in every small gesture, every word chosen, or silence kept. To truly understand them, we must first quiet our own inner universe." The days at the monastery flowed like a steady river, marked by the sound of the bell that called for daily practices. The old monk watched, with the patience of someone who contemplates the blooming of a lotus flower, how the young disciple tried to build his new life within those ancient walls. Every morning, before the first ray of sunlight touched the mountains, the young man was already awake. His nimble hands swept the temple courtyard while others still slept, and his silent footsteps echoed through the corridors as he prepared the meditation cushions for everyone. At night, he was always the last to retire, checking 3 times to ensure all the candles were extinguished and all the incense was safely placed. The other monks remarked on his extraordinary dedication, some even calling him the young enlightened one in respectful jest. But the old monk saw beyond the surface of these actions. In every overly meticulous movement, in every anxious glance seeking approval, he recognized deeply rooted patterns. It's like watching a skilled actor, the old monk thought, who has played a role for so long that he has forgotten he's acting. He saw in the young man the same behavior he had likely developed as the eldest son in his family, always trying to be the perfect example, carrying the weight of expectations like an invisible cloak. On a particularly cold morning, when the mist embraced the monastery like a white blanket, the old monk decided to create a small opportunity for the young man to see his own layers. He took a stack of ancient manuscripts, sacred texts written on palm leaves, aged to a golden hue, and walked deliberately toward the young man, who was meditating in the courtyard. At the exact moment he passed by, the manuscript slipped from his hands. The sound of the sacred texts falling shattered the morning silence like thunder. Instinctively, the young man leapt to his feet to help. But then, something interesting happened. He hesitated. For a brief moment, he froze between the desire to help and the fear of doing something wrong, of handling the sacred texts improperly, of failing to act perfectly. In that moment of hesitation, the old monk saw all the young man's layers revealed, like pages of an open book. He saw the devoted son who never wanted to disappoint his parents, the eldest brother who always had to set the example, the student who never allowed himself to make mistakes, and now, the monk who carried the weight of all these past personas. The sacred texts, the old monk said softly, still not picking up the manuscripts from the ground, are like our own nature. Sometimes we need to let them fall to discover that they don't break. The same is true of our image of perfection. The young man looked at his master, his eyes reflecting the understanding that was beginning to dawn in his heart. Together, they gathered the manuscripts in silence. But something had changed. The old monk noticed how the young man's shoulders were more relaxed, how his movements had become more natural, less rehearsed. The minds of people, the old monk continued as they arranged the texts, are like these manuscripts. Each leaf tells a different story. Each layer reveals a new truth. To read them, we must first accept that some pages may be crumpled, some stories imperfect, and that's perfectly okay. Oh, why? With the arrival of spring, the monastery's garden transformed into a carpet of wildflowers. The sweet aroma of the blossoms filled every corner of the temple, bringing with it a renewed energy for the daily practices. It was during this time that the old monk began to notice a particular pattern in the young disciple's behavior during the morning meditations. Every day, without fail, the young man chose to sit near the same window in the main hall. Other monks occasionally remarked on his apparent distraction, assuming he sought the cool breeze or was captivated by the garden view. But the old monk saw something far deeper in this seemingly innocent habit. He observed how the young man's nostrils would suddenly flare when a breeze carried the fragrance of the flowers. He noticed how his shoulders would relax involuntarily when the aroma grew stronger, and how his breathing became deeper and more natural in those moments. On his face, a genuine peace briefly replaced the mask of serenity he usually wore. One day, as they walked through the garden after meditation, the old monk stopped by a particular flower bed. "These are the same flowers that grew in your home garden, aren't they?" he asked softly. The young man's eyes widened in surprise, but he couldn't suppress a nostalgic smile. "My grandmother used to grow these flowers," he replied, his voice laden with memories. "She used to say they were messengers of peace. When I was a child and felt anxious, she would take me to sit near them." The old monk nodded, understanding the depth of that connection. "Our mind is curious," he said. "Sometimes we seek peace in memories and associations, anchoring our serenity to external elements. It's like a bird that can only sing when it sees the sunrise." The next morning, the young man arrived at the meditation hall to find his usual spot by the window occupied by another monk. The old monk had discreetly rearranged the seating, placing the young man's cushion in the center of the hall far from the window. far from the comforting fragrance of the flowers, far from his zone of comfort. During that meditation session, the old monk observed the young man closely. He saw how his breathing became shallow, how his fingers twitched slightly, and how beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the coolness of the morning. Each subtle reaction revealed how his inner peace was still tethered to external anchors. After the meditation, as the other monks departed, the old monk approached the young man, who remained seated, visibly unsettled. "The true nature of the mind," the old monk said gently, "is like the sky. Clouds may pass, memories, sensations, thoughts, but the sky remains unchanged. When we rely on something external to find peace, it's like trying to grasp a particular cloud, forgetting that we are the sky itself." The young man absorbed these words in silence, his hands still restless in his lap. "But how can I find that peace without my anchors?" he finally asked. "Observe your mind as you observe the garden," the old monk replied. "Flowers bloom and wither, seasons change, fragrances come and go. But the garden remains the garden. Similarly, your thoughts, emotions, and sensations are constantly changing, but your true nature remains unaltered. ... As the seasons changed, the old monk continued his quiet study of the young disciple, observing how certain patterns emerged in his behavior like ripples in a deep lake. It was as if every action the young man took was a drop of rain, creating concentric circles that revealed the true nature of the waters beneath the surface. During communal meals, the old monk noticed a particular pattern that repeated like a secret ritual. Whenever the young man was troubled by inner doubts, something the old monk could discern by the way he rubbed his thumb against his index finger during morning prayers, he would invariably offer his portion of rice to the other monks. It was as though he was trying to fill his inner void with acts of outward generosity. The human mind, the old monk reflected, is like a tireless weaver, constantly creating patterns, always seeking order in the chaos of our emotions. There were also cycles of obsessive cleaning. The old monk observed how, in the days leading up to the young man's great existential doubts, he would begin to clean his surroundings with an almost feverish intensity. First, his room, then the nearby hallways, and finally any area within reach. It was as if he were trying to organize his outer world to compensate for the turmoil within. One morning during one of these intense cleaning sprees, the old monk found the young man on his knees, scrubbing the same spot on the floor over and over, his face tense with worry. Without saying a word, the monk sat nearby and began to prepare tea, purposefully letting a few leaves fall onto the freshly cleaned floor. The young man looked at the fallen leaves with a mix of frustration and resignation. "Master," he finally said, "sometimes I feel like nothing I do is ever enough. There's always another corner to clean, another imperfection to correct." Lola's monk poured 2 cups of tea, the steam curling through the air between them. "Tell me," he said gently, "what is it that you are truly trying to clean?" The question lingered in the air like incense, and the young man felt his defenses begin to crumble. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "It feels like I'm stuck in a cycle. The more I clean, the more dirt I seem to find. The more I give away my food, the emptier I feel." "Ah," the old monk smiled. "Now you are beginning to see the invisible patterns. They are like footprints in the snow. They show not only where we are going, but also where we've been." In the days that followed, the old monk subtly began to disrupt these patterns. When he sensed that the young man's cycle of anxiety was about to begin, something he recognized by the way the young man started organizing and reorganizing his belongings, he assigned him different tasks, breaking the ritual before it could take hold. When he noticed the young man about to give away his meal, something he always recognized by the hesitant way he held his bowl, the old monk discreetly added an extra portion of rice to his own bowl and offered it to the young man before he could give his away. "The patterns of our mind," the old monk explained one evening as they gazed at the stars together, are like the constellations in the sky. We can draw lines between the points and create familiar shapes, but the stars themselves remain unchanged. Our true nature lies beyond the patterns we create. The monsoon season arrived at the monastery like a veil of water draping the mountains. During this time, when the constant droplets created an endless melody on the ancient rooftops, the old monk noticed a significant change in the young disciple's behavior. Every afternoon, as the rain intensified, the young man would make his way to the temple's main hall, where large wooden doors opened to a small ornamental pond. There, he would sit silently for hours, watching the raindrops fall onto the surface of the water. Other monks passed by, some curious, others concerned about his apparent distraction from regular practices. But the old monk saw something deeper unfolding in this quiet ritual. He observed how the young man's eyes followed each drop that touched the pond's surface, how his face softened as the concentric ripples expanded and intertwined, creating intricate patterns on the water. It wasn't the rain itself that fascinated him, the old monk realized, but the way each drop triggered a chain reaction, affecting the entire surface of the pond. On one such rainy afternoon, the old monk quietly approached and sat beside the young man. For a long time, they simply shared the silence, punctuated by the rhythmic sound of the rain. Finally, the young man spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Each drop is like one of our actions, isn't it? Each thought, each word, creating ripples that affect everything around us. The old monk smiled inwardly. The young man was beginning to see beyond the surface, starting to understand the interconnectedness of all things. It was a delicate moment, like the blooming of a lotus flower. It needed to be nurtured with care. In the days that followed, the old monk began creating small situations for the young man to experience this understanding in practice. He left minor tasks unfinished near him, a half-peeled basket of fruit, a pile of dry leaves partially swept, a water jar left half full. He watched as the young man naturally completed these tasks, no longer out of a compulsion for perfection as before, but from a genuine understanding of how his actions could benefit the community. It was as if each act of service was a raindrop, creating ripples of kindness that extended beyond the visible. One morning during meditation, one of the elder monks had a coughing fit. Before anyone could react, a young man was already on his feet, moving silently to fetch water. The old monk noticed how fluid and natural his movements were, free from the hesitation or self-consciousness that had once characterized his actions. "You're learning to read not just the surface, but the depths," the old monk remarked later, as they shared afternoon tea. "It feels as though I can see beyond words and gestures." The young man replied, his eyes shining with newfound understanding, as if each person is a deep lake with currents and movements unseen on the surface. "And what do you see when you look at your own lake?" the old monk asked gently. The young man was silent for a moment, his teacup forgotten in his hands. "I see that I've spent so much time trying to control the waves instead of understanding the deeper currents," he finally replied. "Each of our actions is like those raindrops, isn't it? We can't control all the ripples they create, but we can choose how and where we let our drops fall." With the arrival of a new spring, the monastery was filled with renewed energy. The ancient trees in the courtyard were adorned with delicate blossoms, and the air carried the promise of fresh beginnings. The old monk, seated in his usual spot on the temple veranda, observed not only the changes in nature, but also in the young man who had arrived many moons ago. Gone was the anxious youth who had adjusted his robes every 3 steps. His movements had become as fluid as a flowing stream, his actions as spontaneous as the flight of birds. The transformation was subtle, yet profound, like a stone polished by time and water, revealing its natural patterns. The old monk noticed how the young man now moved through the monastery with a different presence. He was no longer just an observer of patterns, but had become part of the very dance of daily life. His actions arose naturally from the needs of the moment, free from the self-consciousness that had once defined him. During meals, he intuitively knew when a brother needed more food, not out of a sense of duty or sacrifice as before, but from a natural understanding of the flow of things. During meditations, his presence radiated a calm that anchored others without any deliberate effort on his part. One particular morning, as the sun played with the shadows on the mountains, a new aspirant arrived at the monastery. The old monk watched with a quiet smile as the young monk immediately recognized familiar signs, the way the newcomer clutched his bag too tightly, how his eyes darted nervously between unfamiliar faces. Without hesitation or premeditation, the young monk went to the temple kitchen. Moments later, he returned with a steaming cup of jasmine tea, which he offered to the newcomer with a kind smile. The old monk felt his heart expand at the beauty of the moment. The circle was complete. Later that evening, as they shared the silence beneath a starlit sky, the old monk finally spoke. "Do you remember your first day here?" The young monk smiled, his eyes reflecting the light of the stars. "It feels like another lifetime," he replied. "I was so worried about getting everything right, about being the perfect monk, that I could barely see what was right in front of me." "And what do you see now?" the old monk asked gently. "I see that we don't need to try to read people's minds," the young monk said after a moment of thought. "We just need to be truly present with an open heart. People show us everything we need to know in their gestures, in their silences, in the way they move through the world. It's like a dance we're all part of, even without realizing it." The old monk nodded silently. "True wisdom," he said, "is not in trying to decipher others, but in understanding that we are all part of the same dance. Every movement we make affects the whole. Every breath is part of a greater breath." A gentle breeze passed through, carrying the fragrance of nocturnal flowers. In the silence that followed, they both knew that a transformation had been completed. The young man who had arrived, seeking to learn how to read minds, had discovered something far more precious: the art of reading hearts, including his own. And so, the old monk thought, watching his now transformed disciple, the cycle continues. Every ending is merely a new beginning, every student a future teacher, every moment an opportunity for deeper understanding. The true art of reading minds does not come from mystical powers, but from deep observation, an understanding of human patterns, and, above all, the cultivation of genuine compassion. The old monk not only observed the young man's actions, but understood their roots and, with wisdom, created the conditions for his natural growth.